There is a document in a London archive, written in Middle English, in a hand that shakes slightly toward the end of the page, that describes what happened in Cheapside on the 4th of July, 1450. The man who wrote it was there. He saw the whole thing. He wrote it down that night, or perhaps the night after, in the kind of careful, flat language that people use when they have seen something they are not sure they should have watched. He does not give his name. He does not say where he stood. But he tells us what happened, minute by minute, detail by detail, with the precision of a man who understood that someday someone would need to know. This is not a story about a king, or a war, or a rebellion. Not exactly. It is a story about 1 hour on one street in London, on a hot morning in July, when a man was taken from a building he had entered alive and was carried out in pieces. The man had a name, he had a title, he had children, and by noon his head was on a stake, being paraded through the streets he had once governed, pushed against the face of his dead son-in-law in a grotesque mockery of a kiss. It lasted about 30 minutes. This is what it sounded like. This is what it smelled like. This is what the people of London saw on the day their city became, for a few terrible hours, a place where justice and murder were the same thing. The England of 1450 was a kingdom coming apart. Not quickly, not the way a wall falls, but slowly, the way a house rots from the inside. The beams still hold. The roof still looks fine from the road, but the floor gives way when you step in the wrong place, and the smell of damp has been there for years. Henry VI had been king since he was 9 months old. He was now 28. He was, by most accounts that survive, a gentleman, pious, thin-faced, prone to long silences and sudden acts of generosity that his treasury could not afford. He was also, by those same accounts, catastrophically unsuited to rule. He could not control his court. He could not control his lords. And he could not hold France. By the spring of 1450, England had lost nearly everything his father, Henry V, had won. Normandy was gone. Maine was gone. The soldiers who had fought there came home to Kent and Sussex with nothing, no pay, no land, no pension, and found that the men who had sent them to France were still living very well in London. The Duke of Suffolk, the king's closest adviser, had been murdered at sea in May. His body washed ashore at Dover. Nobody was arrested. Nobody was even surprised. Into this void stepped a man who called himself John Mortimer, though his real name, as best anyone could determine, was Jack Cade. Almost nothing about him is certain. He may have been Irish, he may have been a soldier, he may have served in France. What is certain is that in the first week of June, he appeared at Blackheath with 5,000 armed men, peasants, craftsmen, shopkeepers, a few minor gentry, and more than a few veterans of the French wars, and issued a formal list of 15 grievances against the crown. The king sent troops. The troops were routed. Henry fled to Kenilworth. And on the 3rd of July, Cade's army crossed London Bridge and entered the city. Public execution in the 15th century was not what the modern mind imagines. It was not chaos. It was not frenzy. It was, or it was supposed to be, a ritual. The most carefully choreographed public event a medieval city could produce, short of a coronation. There was a theology behind it. The Church, since the decree of Pope Clement V in the early 1300s, required that every condemned person be given the chance to confess before dying. This was not mercy in the modern sense. It was something older and, in its way, more serious. The belief that a man's death could save his soul if he died well. The scaffold was not just a place of punishment. It was the last church the condemned would ever enter. The condemned was expected to speak, to repent, to forgive the executioner, to ask the crowd to pray for him. This was the script. This was, when it went well, when the prisoner accepted his death with what the chronicles called good courage. The crowd went home satisfied that justice and God had both been served. When it went badly, when the prisoner screamed or fought or cursed, the chronicles recorded that too, with a kind of cold disapproval. The executioner himself was a man apart. In London, as in most European cities, the hangman lived on the edge of town, literally. In Southwark, across the river, among the brothels and the bear pits and the leper hospitals, he was paid by the job. He was shunned by his neighbours. He could not enter a church by the main door. His children could not join a guild. And yet he was essential. Without him, the entire apparatus of royal justice stopped. He was the hand of the law. He was also, in the eyes of everyone who watched him work, contaminated by what he touched. The man who would die on the 4th of July was James Fiennes, Baron of Saye and Sele. He was about 55 years old for the time, old for the circumstances. He had served as Lord Treasurer of England. He had been, for years, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. He had also been, according to Cade's manifesto, and to a great many people in Kent and London, one of the most corrupt. The charges were specific. He had sold offices. He had manipulated tax collection. He had profited personally from the loss of France. Whether all of this was true is a question the records do not fully answer. Some of it almost certainly was. But on that morning in July, truth was not the point. The point was that Cade had taken London, the king had fled, and someone had to pay. Saye had been held in the Tower. Cade's men removed him and brought him to the Guildhall for what the chronicles call a trial. It was not a trial in any sense that would satisfy a modern court or even a medieval one conducted in peacetime. He was charged. He was not permitted to answer. He demanded, as was his right as a peer, to be judged by his peers. This was ignored. The whole proceeding lasted. And here the records are vague, but the consensus among the chronicles suggests less than an hour. What we know about Saye's appearance that morning comes from fragments. He was thin. He had been in the Tower for several days. He was dressed, probably, in the clothes he had been wearing when he was arrested, the robes of a lord, now wrinkled and stained. One chronicle mentions that he could barely stand. Whether this was age or illness or fear, the record does not say. The record on many things is silent. His son-in-law, William Cromer, the Sheriff of Kent, was held separately. He would die the same day. Neither man knew that morning exactly how the next hour would unfold. But they knew, as everyone in London knew, what Cade's men had come to do. Minute 1. The doors of the Guildhall open. Saye is brought out into the light. It is July, and the sun is already high enough to turn the stone of the courtyard white. The crowd outside is not a crowd in the modern sense, not a ring of spectators behind a barrier. It is a mass of bodies filling Cheapside from wall to wall, compressed into a street that is perhaps 30 feet wide, stretching in both directions as far as the eye can see. The sound they make is not a roar. It is a pressure. Thousands of voices at once, none of them distinct, all of them merging into a single hum that you feel in your chest before you hear it in your ears. Cheapside in 1450 smelled the way all of medieval London smelled in summer. River mud, horse dung, wood smoke, bread from the bakeries on Bread Street, and the sour tang of ale from every open door. But today there is something else beneath it. The smell of too many bodies in too small a space, standing in the heat, sweating through wool and linen. And under that, the faint metallic note that comes before violence, the smell of iron, or perhaps only the memory of it. Minute 3. The procession begins. Saye is walked, or perhaps carried, or dragged. The accounts differ, from the Guildhall toward the Standard at Cheapside, a stone cross in the middle of the street that served, in ordinary times, as a water conduit and meeting point. Today it serves as a scaffold. The distance is short, a few hundred yards. But in a crowd this dense, movement is slow. The men around Saye are Cade's soldiers, armed, many of them drunk, all of them certain that what they are doing is justice. They clear a path with their shoulders and their voices, and when necessary, with the flats of their swords. Minute 5. Saye reaches the standard. There is a raised area, not a proper scaffold in the later sense, not a wooden platform built for the occasion, but a raised stone base around the cross. The executioner is already there. We do not know his name. We do not know if he was a professional hangman or one of Cade's men given the task for the day. What we know is that he had an axe, and that the axe was sharp enough, and that, when the moment came, he used it. What does a man think about in the minutes before he is executed? The records sometimes tell us. Sometimes a man prayed aloud. Sometimes he asked for water. Sometimes he stared at the crowd and said nothing at all. The convention, the script that the church had written for this moment, was that the condemned would kneel, forgive the executioner, and commend his soul to God. Remember this. The idea of forgiving the man who was about to kill you was not a gesture. It was doctrine. The condemned had to forgive, or his soul was at risk. The executioner had to ask forgiveness, or his was. Both men, in theory, needed each other. It was, if you can hold this thought, a transaction conducted at the edge of death, between a man with an axe and a man with his neck on a block, in which both parties were trying to save something invisible. Minute 8, Saye speaks, or tries to. The chronicles disagree on what he said. One account suggests he attempted to defend himself, to answer the charges he had not been allowed to answer inside the Guildhall. Another suggests he simply asked the crowd to pray for his soul. A third says he could barely speak at all. What is consistent across the accounts is that it did not last long. The crowd was not patient. Cade's men were not patient, and whatever Saye said, or tried to say, was swallowed by the noise. Minute 10. It is worth pausing here before what comes next, because what comes next happens very quickly, and the speed of it is part of the horror. An execution by axe, when the axe is sharp, when the executioner knows his work, takes less than 2 seconds from the moment the blade begins its arc to the moment it lands. The human neck, for all its complexity of bone and tendon and artery, is not a difficult target for a heavy blade swung with force. A single clean stroke can sever it completely. 2 strokes, at most, for a less skilled hand. The chronicles do not tell us how many strokes it took. They tell us only that it was done. Minute 11. The head is separated from the body. There is a sound that a crowd makes in the moment after an execution. A sound that is not a cheer and not a gasp, but something between the two, something guttural, something that comes from the same place in the throat as nausea. The chronicler does not describe this sound, but anyone who has been in a crowd at a moment of extreme collective emotion, a goal in a stadium, a verdict in a courtroom, a building collapsing, knows something close to it. It is the sound of thousands of nervous systems responding at once to the same stimulus. It is involuntary. It is animal. Minute 12. The head is placed on a stake. This was standard procedure. The stake was typically a wooden pole, sharpened at one end, about 8 feet long. The head was fixed to the top. The man who held it, who lifted it above the crowd, was declaring to the city, "This is what happens." The blood, by this point, is everywhere. A severed human neck produces, and there is no way to describe this that does not sound clinical, a great deal of blood very quickly. The straw and sawdust that were laid around the base of the standard are soaked through in seconds. The smell changes. What was iron becomes copper. What was faint becomes overwhelming. The flies, which are always present in a London summer, arrive within minutes. Minute 15. William Cromer, the Sheriff of Kent, is brought to the same spot. His execution is faster. Less ceremony, less speech. The crowd has already seen one death. The second is, and this is perhaps the most disturbing thing about public execution as a regular practice, less interesting to them. The first death is an event. The second is a repetition. Cromer's head joins Saye's on a second stake, minute 18. And here is where the day turns. Cade's men take the two stakes, one bearing the head of the Lord Treasurer of England, the other bearing the head of the Sheriff of Kent, father-in-law and son-in-law, and begin to walk through the streets. This was not unusual. The display of severed heads was common practice after political executions. What was unusual, what multiple chroniclers recorded with something between horror and fascination, was what happened next. The men carrying the stakes pushed the two heads together. Face to face, lips to lips, as if they were kissing. They did this repeatedly, through the streets, for the entertainment of the crowd. Two dead men, their faces slack, their eyes half open, being made to perform an obscene pantomime of affection, while thousands watched and laughed. No chronicler comments on this directly. They record it. They describe it. But they do not say what they thought about it. The silence of the chroniclers, in this case, is louder than anything they could have written. Minute 22. The procession reaches London Bridge. The heads will be placed on the gate, the southern gate, the one that every traveller entering London from the south would see first. Heads on London Bridge were not rare. There were spikes built into the stonework specifically for the purpose. In some years, there were dozens. The heads were parboiled first, boiled in a mixture of water and salt, sometimes with bay leaves, to preserve them and keep the birds away for as long as possible. Whether Saye's head was boiled that day or later, the records do not specify. What is certain is that it remained on the bridge for weeks, possibly months. A grey-haired head on a spike looking south toward Kent, where the rebellion had begun. Minute 25. The bodies are taken away. Where exactly is not clear. The disposal of executed criminals in 15th century London was handled by the executioner or by the church, depending on the circumstances. A man who had confessed and received absolution could, in theory, be buried in consecrated ground. A man who had not, or who was considered a traitor, could not. His body belonged to the crown. It could be quartered. It could be displayed. It could be buried in a ditch. Saye's body was not quartered that day, but it was not returned to his family either. Minute 30. The crowd begins to thin. Not quickly. A crowd this size does not disperse the way water drains from a basin. It loosens. People at the edges drift away. The vendors who had been selling bread and ale at the margins of the spectacle, because there were always vendors. A public execution was, among other things, a market day. Begin to pack up their stalls. And somewhere in the crowd, a man who can read and write, a man whose name we will never know, goes home and opens a book and begins to write down what he saw. The morning after, Cheapside looked almost normal. The straw had been swept, the blood had been washed, or washed enough, with river water carried in buckets from the Thames. The bakers on Bread Street had opened their doors. The vendors had returned to their places. A stranger arriving in London that morning might not have known that anything had happened at all, except for one detail. The flies. The flies were thick near the Standard. They would be thick there for days. Cade's rebellion lasted another week. By the 5th of July, his men had begun looting in earnest, and the citizens of London, who had initially welcomed the rebels, or at least tolerated them, turned against them. On the night of the 5th, a battle broke out on London Bridge itself. It lasted 6 hours. Dozens were killed. The bridge, which was lined with houses and shops, caught fire in places. By dawn on the 6th, a truce was called. By the 7th, pardons were issued. By the 9th, Cade was fleeing south with the price of 1,000 marks on his head. He was caught on the 12th of July, near Heathfield in Sussex. He was wounded in the capture, badly, and died in the cart that was carrying him back to London. His body was taken to Southwark, to the King's Bench, where it was tried posthumously, convicted, beheaded, and quartered. The parts were sent to different towns. His head joined the others on London Bridge. The silence that followed the rebellion was not peace, it was exhaustion. England in the autumn of 1450 was a kingdom that had watched itself do something it could not undo and did not fully understand. The lords who had supported Cade quietly withdrew their support. The commons who had marched went home. The king returned to London and resumed the business of losing his kingdom, which he would do completely within 5 years, when the Wars of the Roses began in earnest. And the dead men stayed on the bridge. The ravens came. The rain came. The heads darkened. And London, as it always does, moved on. Gregory's Chronicle survives. It is held in a collection that has passed through several hands since the 15th century, and it is written in the Middle English of a man who was educated but not aristocratic. A guild member, probably, a man of the middling sort, who lived through the summer of 1450 and felt that someone should write it down. His account of the execution of Saye and Sele is less than a page long. It is factual, it is dry, and it is, in its restraint, one of the most disturbing documents of the English Middle Ages. The Guildhall still stands. It survived the Great Fire of 1666. It survived the Blitz. Its medieval crypt, the largest in London, is still intact. You can walk through it. The stone floor is the same stone floor that Saye walked on the morning he was taken out to die. Tourists photograph the vaulted ceiling. They do not generally think about what happened upstairs. Cheapside is still a street. It is lined with offices and chain restaurants now, and the standard is long gone, replaced by centuries of rebuilding and redesign. But the width of the street is roughly the same. If you stand in the middle of it at midday in July, and close your eyes, and listen to the hum of the crowd around you, the office workers, the tourists, the delivery drivers, you can almost hear it. The sound is different, the frequency is different, but the density is the same. A London street, in summer, full of people who are all going somewhere. The London Stone, the ancient block of limestone that Cade struck with his sword when he declared himself lord of the city, was moved several times over the centuries. It sat behind an iron grille on Cannon Street for decades. It is now displayed at the Museum of London. You can see it. It is smaller than you would expect. It has no inscription. It carries no memory that you can touch. But it was there. Shakespeare wrote the scene. In Henry VI, Part 2, Act 4, Scene 6, he gives Cade a line that may be the most honest thing ever written about political violence, dressed as justice. The rebel captain strikes the stone and declares himself lord, and orders that the water conduits of the city run with wine. It is funny. It is meant to be funny. But underneath the comedy, there is something else. A recognition that the distance between the man who demands justice and the man who cuts off heads is shorter than anyone wants to believe. How do we judge a crowd that watches a man die? The question is not rhetorical, and it is not simple. The people of Cheapside in July of 1450 were not monsters. They were Londoners. They were bakers and weavers and brewers and clerks. They were people who had been taxed beyond endurance by a government that had lost a war, stolen their money, and offered nothing in return. They wanted justice. They got something else. And that is perhaps the oldest story there is. A man is accused, a crowd gathers, a blade falls, and the people who watch go home and eat dinner and sleep in their beds and wake up the next morning in a city that looks the same as it did the day before. Because the blood has been washed away, because the straw has been swept, because the flies, after a few days, find somewhere else to go. The man who wrote the Chronicle, the nameless Londoner who saw it all and put it down in ink, did not say whether he thought it was right or wrong. He recorded the facts. He gave us the minutes. He gave us the names, and he closed the page and put down his pen and lived the rest of his life in a city where, on certain hot days in July, the smell near the Standard was never quite the same. The head stayed on the bridge. The stone stayed in the street. The chronicle stayed in the archive. And the street where it happened is still there. You can walk it. You can stand where the Standard stood. You can look south toward the river, toward the bridge, toward the place where the heads were displayed. And if you stand there long enough, in the middle of the crowd, in the middle of the day, you will notice something. The city is loud. The city is always loud. But there is a kind of silence underneath the noise, the silence of things that happened here and were written down and were never fully understood. It is still there, the silence, under everything.